While the world buried Elvis Presley and mourned him, a hotel room in Memphis stayed off limits for years. It was the last room Elvis Presley used during his final days, and everything he left behind was still in there. When investigators finally opened the door, they found something terrifying in the corner of the room. Did Elvis keep it there on purpose? 50 years of the wrong story. For 50 years, a single hotel room in Memphis had been closed off while the rest of the building continued its ordinary business around it. Guests came and went through every other door on that floor, without knowing that one room at the end of the corridor had been removed from the world. No cleaning crew entered it. No maintenance work was scheduled inside it. The furniture stayed where it had last been arranged. The curtains remained the way they had been left, and the slow accumulation of decades settled over everything inside without interruption. The room had not been formally designated as off-limits through any written policy. It had simply been left alone, and over time, the leaving alone had become its own kind of institution. Elvis Presley had used that room during the final weeks of his life as a private space away from Graceland. The pressures of his schedule, the deterioration of his health, and the increasing difficulty of managing daily life had made a retreat necessary during that period, and the room had served that purpose on multiple occasions in the weeks before his passing on August 16, 1977. The people who had been close enough to those stays to remember them described a man who was exhausted in a way that ordinary rest was not fixing. He moved through the space slowly, kept to himself for long stretches, and made minimal requests of anyone around him. Those who had been present during those visits carried their memories of that time silently in the years that followed. After his tragic demise, the room was not reassigned. The people who worked in the building understood that the room was not going back into use, and that understanding held across the years without needing to be restated. New people who came to work in the building learned about the room from those who had been there longer, and the explanation passed from one generation of workers to the next in the same form. It was Elvis's room, and it had been left the way it was. The interior of the room aged on its own schedule across the following decades. The curtains that had been drawn during his final visit stayed drawn, limiting the light that reached the furniture and the objects left behind. The temperature inside shifted with the Memphis seasons year after year, but without the regular circulation that an occupied room receives. Dust settled at an even pace across every surface. Paper items left in the room dried slowly and became brittle at the edges. Fabric surfaces darkened in the particular way that undisturbed textiles do when they are sealed away from fresh air for long enough. The room became a kind of unintentional archive, holding the physical record of those final weeks in a form that no one was examining. What was left inside the room when the door last closed had never been formally cataloged. The items Elvis left behind during his stays were not collected, assessed, or removed after his passing. They remained exactly where they had been placed, which meant that the room contained a direct physical record of how he had been living during that period. Personal items, materials related to his daily routine, and objects whose significance was not immediately obvious to anyone who might have inventoried them, had all stayed in place while the world outside the room moved through 50 years of change. The sealed conditions had slowed the deterioration of many of those items more than might have been expected, and what remained was more intact than the passage of time allowed it to be. The building itself had helped preserve the room, without anyone planning for that outcome. Its position within the structure meant that direct sunlight reached the room only at limited angles and for limited periods across the day. In addition to the structuring, a building close by had blocked the strongest afternoon light for most of the preceding decades. The combination of that external shading and the drawn curtains had kept ultraviolet exposure low enough to make a meaningful difference to the materials inside. Paper and fabric items that would normally show severe light damage after 50 years had been partially protected by circumstances that had nothing to do with any kind of intentional preservation effort. The room had changed hands several times along with the building that contained it, and each ownership transition had included a briefing on its history. The responses across those transitions had varied in their reasoning, but not in their practical outcome. Some owners had left the room alone out of a sense of respect for what it represented. Others had recognized that reopening it carried complications that were easier to avoid than to manage. Meanwhile, a few managements had raised the possibility of a formal documentation process. but had not moved forward with it. The room had outlasted all of those conversations and remained sealed until a new ownership situation finally produced a different result and set in motion the process that would bring the first people inside it in 50 years. But it wasn't an easy one. Frozen in time. The change in ownership that eventually led to the room being opened was not accompanied by any particular drama. It was a standard transaction in a business where properties regularly moved between owners, and the new group that took control came in with a practical orientation toward every part of the building they had acquired. Their initial assessment covered the entire property, but something happened when the seat reached the sealed room. During their walkthrough, they received the same briefing that previous owners had received about its history and the reasons it had been left undisturbed. What separated this ownership group from its predecessors was the decision they made in response to that briefing. Rather than continuing the existing arrangement, they concluded that a formal process of documentation needed to take place before any plans for the room could be considered. Assembling the right team for the work took time. The new owners wanted people with backgrounds in forensic documentation and historical preservation, individuals whose professional experience involved entering long-abandoned spaces and producing accurate, defensible records of what those spaces contained. They also wanted the team kept small, both to limit disruption to the room during the documentation process and to control the flow of information while the work was still in progress. The people who were ultimately selected came from fields that required precision and restraint, and their instructions were clear as soon as they arrived: record everything, disturb as little as possible, and do not draw conclusions before the full inventory was complete. Before anyone entered the room, the team spent several days working through whatever records the building still held from the relevant period. Those records were useful mainly because of what they were missing. Standard logs from the 1970s existed for every other area of the building, but documentation related to the sealed room became sparse in the weeks approaching August 1977, and then disappeared entirely. A single maintenance entry from late July of that year referenced a request that had been processed through an irregular channel, and the follow-up entry that should have confirmed its completion was not there. The gaps in the record did not tell the team what had happened, but they established that something about the activity surrounding that room during Elvis's final stays had been handled differently from the building's normal procedures. Air quality testing was required before the team could spend any extended time working inside. 50 years of sealed conditions combined with the temperature fluctuations of a Memphis climate had created an interior environment that needed to be assessed for safety before full entry was permitted. Surprisingly, the results were more favorable than the team had initially anticipated. The room had maintained a level of internal stability that was better than expected, given how long it had been closed. The sealed conditions, rather than creating a degraded environment, had functioned in some respects as a preservation system. The absence of regular air exchange had slowed certain deterioration processes, and the materials inside the room had aged at a rate that was slower than the calendar alone would have suggested. The ownership group established a clear information protocol before work began. Findings would be shared only within the immediate team during the active documentation phase, and no external communications about the room's contents would be made until the full inventory was complete and reviewed. Memphis had a particular relationship with Elvis's memory that made premature disclosure a serious concern. The city had maintained a living connection to him across the 50 years since his passing, and the existence of a sealed room containing items from his final weeks was exactly the kind of information that could attract significant outside attention before the documentation team had finished their work. Controlling that process was treated as essential to producing a reliable and complete record. The morning the team prepared to enter the room for the first time, the atmosphere among the group was tense rather than excited. These were professionals who had worked in spaces carrying historical weight before, and they approached the task with the discipline their backgrounds had trained them toward. Equipment was checked, documentation protocols were confirmed, and the sequence of steps for the initial entry was reviewed. For half a century, no one had touched the door or looked beyond it. When the team finally forced it open, they stepped into something far beyond their expectations. What waited inside challenged everything they thought they understood and forced them to rethink their mission. In that moment, all their planning felt incomplete, as the discovery pushed their work into a direction they had never truly prepared for. Inside Elvis Presley's state of mind, The first thing the documentation team registered when they entered the room was the stillness. It was not simply quietness in the way that unoccupied spaces tend to be quiet. It was the deeper stillness of a place that had been sealed against ordinary time for decades, where the air itself seemed to carry a different weight than the air in the corridor outside. The curtains filtered what little light reached the interior into a dim, even tone that flattened the shadows and made the room look less like a photograph of the past than like something still suspended in it. The team moved slowly through the initial entry, following their protocol and resisting the impulse to touch anything before documentation had begun. What surrounded them as they adjusted to the space was a room that looked, in most respects, exactly as it had been left. The furniture was positioned in a way that reflected use rather than the standard arrangement of a hotel room prepared for a new guest. A chair had been pulled away from the wall and angled toward the window. The bedside surface held items that had been placed there with the casual specificity of someone who had settled into the space for more than a single night. A pair of reading materials rested on a low table in a way that suggested they had been set down mid-use and not returned to. The overall impression was of a room whose last occupant had stepped out with the intention of returning, and the 50 years since that departure had not rearranged anything to disturb that impression. The medications cataloged in the room represented a significant portion of the early inventory. They were present in a quantity and variety that the team documented carefully and without immediate interpretation, following their instructions to record before concluding. The containers were from that period, and their labels reflected prescriptions that corresponded to conditions associated with Elvis's health in his final years. What the medications indicated about the state of his daily management of those conditions was something the team noted in their records for later analysis. The number of separate prescriptions present and the stage of depletion in each container provided information about patterns of use during his time in the room that had not been available to anyone examining his health history from the outside. Personal items found throughout the space added texture to the picture the room was assembling. Clothing items left behind included pieces that were consistent with the informal, private version of Elvis that people close to him had described during that period. Not the stage presentation that the public associated with him, but the simpler, quieter version of the man who existed when no performance was required. Small objects with no obvious practical function were distributed across various surfaces, the kind of items that gathered gradually around a person when they have spent real time in a space and arranged it to their own comfort. The room had the quality of a personal environment rather than a temporary accommodation. Handwritten materials formed a separate category in the inventory and received particular attention from the team. Several sheets of paper were found in various locations around the room, some on flat surfaces and some folded in ways that suggest they had been handled repeatedly. The content of those materials covered a range of subjects, both personal and professional related ones. There were scheduling notes, fragments of text, and entries that the team could not immediately classify. The handwriting across the different sheets showed variation that was consistent with the physical condition Elvis had been in during that period. Some entries written in a firm and controlled hand, and others showing the less steady quality that had been noted in materials from his later years. Physical evidence of how Elvis had been spending his time in the room was also present in less obvious forms. The wear patterns on the furniture, the distribution of items across the available surfaces, and the specific areas of the room that showed the most signs of use all pointed towards someone who had been spending extended time in the space rather than simply sleeping there between other obligations. The chair pulled toward the window had clearly been used for long periods of thinking. The area near the telephone showed signs of concentrated activity. Small details of that kind, taken individually, were unremarkable. Taken together and mapped against the timeline of Elvis's final weeks, they suggested a man who had sought solace in that room and used it as a place to think and to be alone in a way that his life at Graceland did not easily permit. The team completed their initial walkthrough and began the more systematic phase of documentation with a clearer sense of what the room represented. It was not simply a preserved space from the past. It was a physical record of a specific and significant period in Elvis's life, one that had been sealed away before anyone had thought carefully about what it contained or what it might eventually reveal. The inventory that followed the initial walkthrough would take several days to complete, and as it progressed, the nature of the room's contents would become progressively clearer. The object that would ultimately define the entire documentation process was not among the first things the team noticed when they entered, but it was present in the room from the beginning, waiting to be reached. The standout detail. The team had worked through most of the room's contents before they reached the item that changed the nature of everything they had documented up to that point. It was not found in an obvious location. It was not positioned in a way that called attention to itself. And during the initial walkthrough, it had not registered as different in kind from the other materials around it. What brought it into focus was the systematic progression of the inventory, the movement through every surface and compartment in the room, that eventually brought the team to the corner of the space where it had been placed. When the full nature of the item became clear, the team paused their documentation process and spent a considerable amount of time with it before recording it and moving on. What they found was a sealed envelope with a handwritten notation on the exterior. The handwriting matched the samples already cataloged from elsewhere in the room, placing it firmly within the period of Elvis's final stay. The seal was intact after 50 years, and the condition of the paper, while aged, was sufficient for the notation on the exterior to be read clearly. What that notation said was what stopped the team. The notation referenced a specific date. That date was not August 16, 1977, the day Elvis passed away. It was earlier, falling within the window of the time he spent in the room, and it was written in a way that indicated it had been placed there to be found and understood in relation to that date, rather than simply as a label or a marker. The phrasing of the notation was brief, but its implication was not ambiguous to the people reading it in context. It suggested that when Elvis placed the envelope in that location and wrote what he wrote on the exterior, he was doing so with an awareness that something was approaching. Not as a vague fear or an abstract premonition, but as a specific reckoning with a timeline he appeared to believe was real. The contents of the envelope, once reviewed through appropriate preservation protocols, deepened what the exterior notation had implied. The materials inside were handwritten and covered several pages in a script that showed the variation in steadiness already noted in other samples from the room. The content was personal rather than addressed to any specific recipient, and it covered several subjects in a way that moved between the practical and the reflective. There were references to people in Elvis's life that carried the quality of final assessments rather than ordinary observations. There were notations about specific possessions and what he wanted to happen to them. There were passages that addressed his own condition with a directness that was striking given how consistently that condition had been managed and minimized in the accounts of those around him during the same period. What made the discovery genuinely alarming rather than simply significant was the combination of the date on the exterior and the specificity of what was inside. Elvis had not written in general terms about mortality or uncertainty. He had written as someone who had arrived at a particular conclusion about his own situation and was responding to that conclusion with a clarity that his public circumstances during the same period did not reflect. His performances, his scheduled appearances, and the accounts of people around him from those final weeks painted a picture of someone who was struggling but still engaged with the continuation of his career. The envelope and its contents painted a different picture entirely. The team's reaction to the discovery was not panic, but the word that several of them later used to describe the experience was the same word that made its way into the summary documentation: terrifying. The terror was not of a supernatural or irrational kind. It was the specific unease that comes from finding evidence that a well-known story has a layer to it that has never been examined, and that the layer changes the meaning of what came before it. If Elvis had known, or had strong reason to believe, that he was approaching the end of his life in the days before his demise, then the behavior of the people closest to him during that same period became something different from what it had appeared to be. The question of what they had known and when, and what they had chosen to do with that knowledge, was no longer answerable by the existing record. The envelope was carefully preserved and added to the documented inventory of the room's contents. The team completed the work they had come to do, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted after the discovery. What had been a careful cataloging of the physical past had become something more urgent, and the implications of what they had found would take the examination well beyond the walls of the room itself. A course, the implications of the discovery. The documentation team completed their inventory and secured the room's contents under preservation protocols before any broader discussion of the findings began. The ownership group was briefed on the results in full, and the envelope and its contents occupied most of that conversation. The decision about what to do with the discovery required time and careful consideration, because Elvis wasn't just anyone. The implications extended far beyond the building where the room was located. The findings touched on the official account of Elvis's final weeks, on the conduct of people who had been close to him during that period, and on the long history of public understanding about how and why he lost his life. None of those were small subjects, and the path from documentation to disclosure was not a straightforward one. The official narrative surrounding Elvis's passing had always contained tensions that his most serious biographers had noted, and that his most devoted followers had argued about for decades. The medical findings from August 16, 1977, had produced a cause of death that was subsequently revised and debated across years of additional examination. The role of prescription medication in his decline had been addressed in various accounts with varying degrees of clarity. The question of what the people around him had known about the state of his health, and whether any of them had understood the true severity of his condition before it became a crisis, had never been fully resolved. The envelope found in the sealed room did not answer all of those questions, but it made them significantly harder to set aside. What the contents of the envelope made newly urgent was the question of informed awareness. If Elvis had reached the conclusion reflected in what he wrote, and if he had reached it during the window of time documented by the materials in the room, then the people who had been with him and around him in the days that followed had been present with a man who was operating with that awareness. The people who arranged his schedule, managed his medications, and spent time with him in the period between the writing of those materials and the morning of his demise were now subjects of renewed scrutiny in a way that the existing historical record had not fully anticipated. The gap between what Elvis appeared to know about his own condition and what those around him acknowledged knowing about it was a gap that the discovery forced into view. The re-examination that followed the documentation process drew on the existing body of research into Elvis's final period and extended it with the new material. Investigators who reviewed the findings spent considerable time cross-referencing the dates, the medication inventory from the room, and the content of the handwritten materials against the known timeline of Elvis's activities and appointments in the weeks before his passing. Several points of inconsistency emerged from that cross-referencing. Accounts given by people close to Elvis in the years following his demise described a man who had not fully grasped how serious his condition was. The materials found in the room suggested the opposite, and the distance between those two versions of Elvis's final weeks was not a small one. The behavior of the people who had been managing Elvis's day-to-day life during that period took on a different character when read against the backdrop of what the room contained. Decisions about his schedule, his medication management, and the level of medical oversight he was receiving in those final weeks had all been made by people who were, in some cases, later questioned about their choices. Some of those people had defended their conduct on the basis that they had not understood how close to the end Elvis was. The envelope introduced a complication to that defense because it raised the possibility that someone in his immediate circle had known about its existence, or had known what Elvis had been writing, without that knowledge ever becoming part of the official account. The 50 years that separated the sealing of the room from its reopening had allowed a particular version of events to solidify into accepted history. That version had been challenged before by biographers and investigators who found inconsistencies in the medical record and in the testimony of witnesses. But the challenges had always faced the fundamental limitation of working from incomplete physical evidence. The room's contents changed the evidentiary landscape in a way that previous challenges had not been able to do, because they provided a direct, preserved, and datable record of Elvis's own understanding of his situation during the period in question. That record did not resolve every disputed aspect of the story, but it placed the burden of explanation firmly on the parts of the official account that had always been the most difficult to defend, and it did so with the weight of 50 years of unexamined preservation behind it. The room that had been sealed in the summer of 1977 had held its evidence through every subsequent decade without anyone knowing precisely what it contained. What the reopening revealed was not a simple addition to the known facts of Elvis's demise. It was a disruption of the framework within which those facts had been understood, and the work of accounting for what it meant was only beginning when the documentation team completed their inventory and closed the door behind them for the last time. For 50 years, that room held its silence while the rest of the world filled in the gaps with whatever version of the story it preferred. The investigators who walked through that door were not looking for anything extraordinary. They were simply doing a job, but what they found in that room did not belong to the ordinary. Some discoveries do not come with clean answers, and this was one of them. The questions it raised were only just beginning. Do you think Elvis Presley already predicted or perceived that his life was coming to an end?